The fluorescent lights of the martial arts gym cast a harsh, unforgiving glow, illuminating a scene that would forever shatter the illusion of hierarchy for all who witnessed it. A black belt, Derek Mitchell, stood at the center of the mat, his arrogance a palpable force, challenging the gym's janitor to a demonstration. "Hey, you there cleaning? How about a quick demonstration?" he bellowed, his voice dripping with condescension. "I bet you've never seen a real fight in your life, right?" This wasn't merely a challenge. It was an act of public degradation, a theatrical performance designed to reinforce a power dynamic built on flimsy assumptions. James Washington, 42, stopped mopping, his movements slow, deliberate. He had been the janitor here for only 3 weeks, a ghost in the after hours, meticulously erasing the day's sweat and effort. Tonight, however, advanced classes had run late, trapping him in the spotlight. "I don't want to bother you, Sensei," James replied, his voice calm, almost detached, as he returned to scrubbing a stubborn stain. "Just finishing up here so you can get back to it." Derek's laughter, loud and theatrical, echoed, a hollow sound in the cavernous space. "Everyone, look at this. The guy's afraid to even step on the mat." The 8 students present chuckled nervously, some visibly uncomfortable, sensing the predatory nature of their instructor's humor. Was this sensei truly embodying the virtues of martial arts? Or was he merely a pawn of the big lie that superficial status equates to genuine power? What Derek didn't know was that James had spent the last 2 decades meticulously burying a past that defined him, a past he desperately wanted to forget. 20 years since he'd stepped out of the ring after an accident that shattered his world. 20 years guarding a secret so profound, not even his teenage daughter knew. "Come on, man," Derek pressed, his arrogant smile a weapon he wielded against perceived weakness. "Just a little demonstration. I bet you don't even know how to do a basic guard. How about showing my students the difference between someone who trains and someone who just cleans?" James felt it then, a familiar sensation stirring in his chest, like a dormant beast awakening from a long enforced slumber. His eyes met Derek's briefly, and for a split second, an unseen current passed between them. The instructor recoiled, an involuntary step back, a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. "Just an educational demonstration," Derek insisted, his voice now betraying a hint of his fleeting unease. "Nothing too serious, just to show the beginners why it's important to respect the martial art. Machiavelli once wrote that it is safer to be feared than loved, but a fool's fear is easily dismissed." Derek's bluster was a paper shield against a threat he couldn't yet comprehend. James set the bucket down and straightened slowly. His movements held an unnerving fluidity, a grace alien to someone supposedly unfamiliar with a tatami mat. Around the gym, training ceased as students watched, sensing a shift in the air, a silent prelude to something extraordinary. "All right," James finally said, his voice as calm as a lake before a hurricane. "But when we're done, you're going to apologize to all of them for turning the mat into a circus." Derek forced a laugh, its falseness thinly veiled. "Apologize, man? You're going to be the one apologizing to the floor when you meet it." The truth was a hidden fortress. James Washington had once been known as James Silent Storm Washington, a 5-time world mixed martial arts champion. He had retired at the zenith of his career after an accident in the ring cost the life of his best friend and training partner. He had vowed never to fight again. But some vows are meant to be broken when the integrity of self, the inherent dignity of a human being, is on the line. This wasn't just about a janitor. It was about the insidious exploitation trap, the system that dismisses greatness when it doesn't fit a predetermined mold. Derek adjusted his black belt with a flourish, relishing the captive audience. "Everyone gather around. You're about to see a practical demonstration of why there is a hierarchy in the world of martial arts." James observed as the 8 students formed a semicircle. Some were eager, others profoundly uncomfortable. A young Asian woman, hair tied back, murmured to her classmate, who shook his head in disapproval. "Look, everyone," Derek continued, gesturing expansively. Here we have a perfect example of someone who never understood that there are appropriate places for certain types of people. Elite gyms are not for, well, you know. The unspoken words hung heavy, a toxic cloud of prejudice. James felt that familiar pang in his chest, echoing the racist comments from 20 years ago that had once fueled his destructive rage. But at 42, his anger was no longer a weapon of uncontrolled fury. It was a cold, calculating fuel for strategic power.
Sensei Derek, the young woman, Sarah Chun, interrupted timidly. Maybe we can continue our normal training. It's getting late.
Derek cut her off sharply.
Sarah Chun, are you questioning my teaching methodology? Sit down and watch. You'll learn more in the next 5 minutes than in a month of conventional training. He used her full name, a blatant assertion of authority, and James saw the fear in her eyes. It mirrored the panic he'd felt 2 decades ago, waking from nightmares, reliving the accident that killed Tony Hammer Rodriguez, his best friend. Tony died because James had lost control, pressured by racist taunts, throwing a series of punches with excessive force. The investigation called it an accident, but James knew the chilling truth. His own rage had taken a life.
So, Janitor, Derek sneered, circling James like a predator scenting weakness. How about showing my students how to do a basic guard? Or is that too complicated for someone who only knows how to push a mop?
Laughter rippled, but James remained motionless, eyes closed for a moment. He was back in that Las Vegas ring, hearing the same venomous comments that preceded his personal tragedy.
What's the matter? Are you scared? Derek pressed. Or are you just going to stand there like a lamppost like you do with a squeegee all day? This was Derek's fatal miscalculation. He pushed James lightly on the shoulder, a seemingly harmless touch, yet laden with the full weight of his unearned arrogance. James absorbed the push without an inch of movement, his feet rooted to the ground like ancient oak. Derek felt as if he'd struck a concrete wall, his arrogant smile faltering.
Interesting, James muttered, more to himself than to Derek.
It's been a while since someone tried to provoke me like that. It wasn't a threat. It was the chilling calm of a man who had traversed the deepest valleys of despair and emerged, not broken, but forged into something far more dangerous.
Derek, too blinded by ego to read the primal signals, doubled down. Did you hear that, guys? He thinks it's interesting. How about we show him the difference between thinking and knowing? He didn't realize that every humiliating word, every dismissive gesture was reawakening not anger, but something far more potent. The crystalline memory of James Washington, the silent storm, the champion. Sarah Chun watched, a growing unease coiling in her gut. The janitor's breathing, the almost imperceptible tensing of his muscles, reminded her of nature documentaries, the terrifying stillness before a predator strikes. "Last chance, buddy," Derek announced, irritation now coloring his voice. "Either you accept the demonstration like a man, or I call security to escort you out, and guess what? You lose your job too." James opened his eyes slowly. When his gaze met Derek's, the instructor felt a primal chill, as if he had just prodded a slumbering dragon, mistaking it for a harmless garden lizard. "All right," James said, his voice low, but now imbued with an authority that silenced the entire gym. "But when we're done, I want you to explain to your students why you turned a place of learning into a circus of humiliation." Derek laughed, but the sound was thin, nervous. "Explain, man. You're going to have a lot of explaining to do when you're on the floor." Neither knew that James had spent 2 decades not merely running from his past, but meticulously perfecting an emotional control that had transformed his former destructive rage into something devastatingly effective. Each humiliation now stoked a cold determination, a silent strength his former opponents knew well, but which Derek was about to discover in the most brutal possible way. Derek adjusted his posture, preening in the suddenly respectful silence that had fallen over the gym. His 8 students formed a perfect circle, some eager for the spectacle, others visibly uncomfortable. "Everyone,"
You are about to witness a lesson worth more than 6 months of training, Derek announced theatrically, extending his arms like a showman. The difference between those who dedicate their lives to martial arts and those who just, well, clean the floor where real fighters walk. James stood motionless, but an imperceptible shift had occurred in his breathing. His eyes closed briefly, and he wasn't in that Denver gym anymore. He was back in the National Gymnasium in Las Vegas, 22 years ago, hearing identical taunts before his world title fight against Victor, the Demolition Man, Petrov. "Look at that little black guy. He won't last 3 rounds against a real fighter," someone in the stands had screamed. James had won by TKO in the second round, but the victory was poisoned. The pressure of racist insults had caused him to lose control in the subsequent sparring session, leading to Tony Rodriguez's accidental death. The memory was a cold fire, tempering him, shaping his next moves not into revenge, but into an inevitable reckoning. "So, Janitor," Derek sneered, circling James like a vulture. "How about showing my students how not to do a basic guard? Or is that too complicated for someone who only knows how to push a mop?" That's when Sarah Chun, the 22-year-old purple belt in jiu-jitsu and master's student in sports psychology, finally broke her silence. For 2 years, she'd documented discrimination in sports for her thesis. What she was witnessing was not just academic material. It was a deeply disturbing moral injury. "Sensei Derek," she interrupted firmly, "why exactly do you think it's necessary to humiliate someone who is just doing his job?" The silence was deafening. Derek slowly turned, eyes narrowed, a mixture of surprise and irritation on his face. "Excuse me, Sarah, but who's teaching the class here?" "You are," she replied calmly. "But that shouldn't include racial humiliation disguised as a technical demonstration." Nervous glances exchanged among the students. No one had ever challenged Derek like this. The instructor's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Racial?" Derek scoffed, forcing a laugh. "This has nothing to do with race. It has to do with respect for the martial art and knowing your place." James opened his eyes. Something in Sarah's courage, this young woman standing up to entrenched authority, reminded him of his younger sister, Keisha. She'd possessed that same fierce determination, that same refusal to accept injustice silently. Keisha had died at 17, a victim of a stray bullet during a police confrontation. James was in Japan when he received the news. Another loved one lost while he pursued glory in distant rings. Another reason to abandon everything, to disappear into an anonymous life. "Sarah," Derek said, his voice dangerously low, "if you can't respect my teaching methods, maybe you should look for another gym. There are places more suited to people with your mentality." The threat hung heavy, toxic. Sarah felt a chill but stood her ground. "My tuition is paid, Sensei, and I believe that everyone here deserves a learning environment based on mutual respect, not humiliation." That's when James did the unexpected. He smiled, not a nervous, submissive smile, but a slow, calculated transformation. It was the smile of a strategist who had just found a compelling reason to stop hiding. For 20 years, he'd carried the crushing weight of guilt from 2 deaths linked to his fighting career. Now, watching a brave young woman defend the very principles of justice he had abandoned, James Washington began to remember who he truly was. "Derek," James said, his voice carrying an unyielding authority that compelled every head to turn. "The young lady is right. This isn't about martial arts. It's about you trying to feel important by belittling others." Derek spun on his heels, face crimson with indignation. "How dare you lecture me about martial arts? You don't even know what a dojo is." James took a step forward, and his posture fundamentally transformed. Shoulders straightened, center of gravity lowered imperceptibly, feet positioning in a stance any experienced fighter would instantly recognize as perfect. "Actually," James said calmly, "I know exactly what a dojo is, and I know that this place stopped being one a long time ago." Derek felt an inexplicable chill. James's movements, the way he occupied space, awakened every instinct for self-preservation. But his wounded pride, that Machiavellian flaw, wouldn't allow him to back down. "Enough talk," Derek growled, assuming his favorite fighting stance. "I'll teach you respect the hard way." Sarah watched, apprehension mixed with professional fascination. Her research into sports biomechanics had involved hundreds of hours of footage of legendary fighters. What she now saw in the Janitor, the economy of movement, the controlled breathing, the calm, radiating, contained power, reminded her of those masters. James closed his eyes briefly, allowing 22 years of muscle memory to resurface. Every technique perfected, every victory won, every brutal lesson learned in the world's toughest rings. When he opened them, Derek was staring into the eyes of Silent Storm Washington, 5-time world champion. "Last chance to apologize," James offered, his voice still kind. "To her, to your students, and to turn this place back into a learning space." Derek laughed, a nervous, forced sound. "Apologize, man? You'll be begging for forgiveness when you're on the floor." What Derek couldn't see was that James had already cataloged every technical weakness. The high guard exposing his body, the predictable retreat with his right leg, the micro movements of his shoulder telegraphing every punch. 2 decades away hadn't dulled decades of refined analysis. Sarah noticed other students instinctively backing away, like animals sensing an impending storm. The air crackled. As everyone laughed at Derek's latest taunt, something unexpected hardened in James's expression. Not anger, but the calm determination of a man who had found a cause worthy of breaking a 20-year vow of silence. Some began to grasp that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Derek assumed his classic intimidation stance, feet shoulder-width apart, fists clenched, weight slightly forward, the stance of someone trained in controlled environments against predictable opponents. James stood motionless, simply observing, his eyes cataloging every detail, exposed ribs, unstable base, excessive tension. "Still waiting?" Derek sneered, hopping slightly. "Or are you just going to stand there like a lamppost?" Then James moved. It was not dramatic, just a subtle repositioning of his feet, a slight lowering of his center of gravity, shoulders relaxing into a perfectly horizontal line. But to those who knew, the transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. Sarah Chun felt a chill. Her 2 years studying sports biomechanics screamed. This was the transition from ordinary man to born predator, a change as subtle as it was devastating. "Interesting," Derek muttered, his confidence faltering. The way James now occupied the space, a palpable aura, awakened his deepest self-preservation instincts. James took a step forward. Derek instinctively recoiled. The movement was so involuntary, so primitive, that students gasped. A black belt backing away from a janitor. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. "Problem?" James asked softly, his voice carrying an authority that silenced everyone. Derek's face flushed. His reputation, his authority was being shredded before his students. He couldn't back down, even as every fiber of his being screamed to stop. "No problem." Derek forced a smile. "Just admiring your posture. Did someone teach you that on YouTube?" The joke landed flat, unlaughed. The tension was suffocating. "Actually," James said calmly, "I learned it at a place called the Las Vegas National Gym. Maybe you've heard of it." Derek frowned. The name resonated, but he couldn't place it. "Las Vegas? What kind of weekend boot camp did you do there?" Sarah Chun discreetly pulled out her phone, typing. What she found made her blood run cold. Not a boot camp. The training ground for the greatest MMA champions of the last 3 decades. "Derek," James continued, his voice still calm. "Last chance. Apologize to Sarah for questioning her right to speak. Apologize to your students for turning this place into a circus. And most of all, apologize to yourself for becoming exactly the kind of person martial arts should teach you not to be." The offer of clemency hung in the air,
A final opportunity for humility. Derek could have saved a shred of dignity. Instead, he attacked. Derek's first punch was technically perfect. A fast, accurate jab. It would have worked on 99% of his sparring partners. James was not in the 99%. The movement was so fluid, so instantaneous, that half the students couldn't process it. James simply wasn't there. His body slid aside like water around a rock. Derek was off balance, his arm extended into empty air. "Nice try," James commented softly, perfectly balanced, repositioned. "Clean technique, adequate speed, but you telegraph the move with your right shoulder." Derek spun wildly, trying to locate his opponent. How? "Beginner's luck," he muttered, trying to convince himself. The second attack came. Jab, straight, hook. A precise combination, practiced thousands of times. Again, James simply wasn't there. Sarah, this time, managed to follow. James lowered himself, the jab whistling inches over his head. The straight punch found only air as he leaned back in an impossible curve. When Derek threw the hook with all his might, James took a minute step back, the fist passing millimeters from his chin. "Interesting combination," James observed, breathing evenly. "Works well against people who stand still, but you're leaving your left side completely exposed." Derek was sweating. This wasn't normal. He'd landed thousands of punches. Now he couldn't touch a man who supposedly never fought. "Stop dancing and fight!" Derek screamed, launching an even more aggressive sequence. That's when James decided the demonstration had gone on long enough. Derek's third attack, a desperate flurry of punches and kicks, found only air. But this time, when Derek recovered, James was inexplicably closer. "How?" Derek whispered, realizing he'd lost all control of the distance. "Derek," James said softly, now an arm's length away, "do you want to know the difference between someone who learned to fight in gyms and someone who learned in professional rings?" Before Derek could answer, James did something that defied physics. Without apparent force, without sudden movement, he simply touched Derek's chest with the palm of his right hand. Derek flew. He wasn't pushed. He was propelled backwards as if struck by an invisible wave. His feet left the ground. He traveled nearly 2 meters through the air, landing on his back with an impact that made everyone gasp. The silence was absolute. Derek lay staring at the ceiling, trying to process it. There was no pain, just the irresistible force of someone operating on an entirely different plane. "That's impossible," Derek muttered, struggling to rise. Sarah Chun had stopped breathing. In 2 years of studying martial arts, she'd never witnessed such controlled, devastating power. No brutality, no anger, just the clinical application of a legendary technique. "Actually," James said calmly, reaching out a hand to help Derek to his feet. "It's quite simple once you understand leverage, timing, and energy transfer. Principles I've learned over a 22-year professional career." Derek ignored the hand, standing on shaky legs. 22-year professional career in what?" Sarah answered, her voice a whisper. "You don't understand who he is, do you?" Everyone turned to her, still clutching her phone, the search results blazing on screen. Dozens of articles, photos, videos confirmed her instincts. "James Washington," she read aloud, "also known as Silent Storm, 5-time world mixed martial arts champion, considered one of the best technical fighters in history, retired undefeated after a 22-year career, following an accident that resulted in the death of his training partner." The words hit like a bomb. Derek's face went pale. He had challenged a living martial arts legend, publicly humiliated a man who could have incapacitated him with a casual move. Five-time world champion? Derek stammered, all arrogance evaporating. James nodded. "I retired at 29. Since then, I've worked whatever jobs I can find. Cleaning, maintenance, simple jobs, simple life, no spotlight, no cameras, no need to prove anything to anyone." The transformation in Derek was instantaneous, painful to watch. The arrogant man vanished, replaced by someone who finally understood the magnitude of his ignorance. I didn't know, Derek whispered. If I had known. If you had known, would you have treated me with respect? James interrupted gently. But would you still have humiliated some other janitor? Another worker who had no credentials to defend himself? The question cut deeper than any physical blow. Derek realized James had pinpointed the root of his problem. Not ignorance of credentials, but the fundamental arrogance that made him believe he could humiliate anyone based on their profession. Sensei Derek, Sarah stepped forward, her voice firm. For 2 years, I have trained at this academy out of respect for your experience. But what I witnessed today was not teaching. It was bullying disguised as instruction. Other students murmured in agreement. James's revelation had shattered their perspective. James, Derek said, his voice imbued with a humility no one had ever heard. I sincerely apologize to you, to Sarah. To everyone here, I have no excuse for my behavior. James nodded, accepting the apology with the same grace he'd shown in the confrontation. Appreciated, Derek. But apologies are only the first step. The question is, what are you going to do differently from now on? Derek looked around the room, seeing his students with new eyes. Some disappointed, others reevaluating everything they thought they knew about respect and hierarchy. I'll change, Derek promised. It'll take time, but I'll change. That's when Sarah asked a question that surprised everyone. Mr. Washington, would you consider teaching again? Because I think we could all learn a lot more from someone who understands that true strength comes with responsibility. James smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him that night. Maybe, but not to teach fighting techniques, to teach something much more important. That respect isn't earned with belts or titles, but with character. As Derek fully absorbed the most humiliating lesson of his life, one question hung in the air. Would one night of humility be enough to transform decades of arrogance? Or would a deeper, systemic change be necessary for true justice to be served? 3 months later, the gym was completely transformed. James Washington was no longer just the janitor. Sarah Chun had convinced the gym owner to hire him as an instructor specializing in advanced techniques and martial arts philosophy. Derek Mitchell lost half his students in the first week. The video Sarah had discreetly recorded spread across social media, showing a black belt humiliated by a mere janitor. His reputation in the martial arts community was ruined, a cautionary tale for those who equate status with worth. Sensei James, Sarah said after a class on respect and humility, thank you for teaching me that true strength doesn't need to be displayed to be recognized. James smiled, organizing equipment. The best lesson I can teach is simple. Never judge someone by their profession or appearance. Everyone carries stories that can surprise us. Derek continued teaching at a smaller gym, humbled by public shame. He had learned the hard way that arrogance comes at a price. Sometimes, justice arrives quietly, like a storm that transforms everything without making a sound. James proved that true revenge is not destroying your opponent, but showing that greatness comes from character, not titles, shattering the exploitation trap for good.